This is actually kind of a draft of the last chapter of the book that Dr. Sang mentioned. So it's very much a work in progress, but I like to model kind of having works in progress and sharing them with a group of people because our ideas don't have to be completely fleshed out before we begin to share them and get feedback from others. And so I want to start by kind of just talking about an experience that I had in working with the school district of Philadelphia when it was working to expand its dual language education programs in, I would say, 2013, 2014. As part of that work, I was working with the district to raise awareness of what dual language education programs were, the research about those programs, supporting teachers in changing their pedagogies to adapt to this dual language context. One of the things that I did was go into different schools to meet with parents to talk about the program. And in school one, which was a school in a gentrifying area of the city, a white mother described wanting her children to be trilingual in English and Spanish, because the program was going to be in Spanish, and Mandarin from the nanny who was Mandarin speaking. This comment was in sharp contrast to a comment that I heard in school two, which was a segregated, low-income, predominantly Latinx area of the city, where a Puerto Rican mother shared in Spanish, being homeless for several months, and she was looking for special programs that would support her daughter. So she didn't know what a dual language program was, but she was wondering if it would provide her daughter the types of emotional support that she needed after the trauma of housing instability. And so these are two mothers doing what good mothers do, right? They're both trying to find the best opportunities for their children, but they're starting from very different starting points in terms of what opportunities they have available to them. And so as these programs began to be developed, School One received a great deal of media attention. And people were really excited about the program. There was an article that came out in a local newspaper that said that it was bringing parents back into public education, which kind of ignores the fact that there were already many parents that were in public education, but it was seen as kind of this really celebratory thing that this program was appearing in this context. School Two was ignored by the media. It was not seen as something that needed to be celebrated at all because of the student population that it served. And so what happened with School One is that dual language parents brought more resources to the program and to the school, right? They were able to advocate for the school at the district level. They were able to fundraise and bring lots of resources to the school. Whereas in School Two, the program was really framed as a transitional program by most of the school staff. They were assuming that it was just for Spanish-dominant students, that there really wasn't any need for developing bilingualism of this particular student population. And so I'm observing these stark differences, and I'm trying to reflect at the time about how the expertise that I've developed as an educational linguist can help me to understand and make sense of what I'm observing and how I might be able to address it, right? So in my work with teachers at the time, some of the teachers were teaching in transitional programs, right, like the one in School One. So I was working with them to think about the changes in pedagogy that need to come from moving from a transitional model where the goal is to move from Spanish to English fairly quickly to a dual language model where the goal is to develop both languages, right? And one of the things that we focused on there was this idea of translanguaging, kind of supporting students and using their entire linguistic repertoire for making sense in the classroom. And I provided lots of professional development support for teachers based on that expertise that I had developed, right? And working with parents, I was able to illustrate to that first parent. She asked me what I thought about raising her child trilingually, and I was able to point her to the research that shows that there are many cognitive and cultural benefits of multilingualism, and that I wouldn't be worried about having her child speak multiple languages, and that's actually a good thing. Now, the mother in School Two, I really didn't have a lot of expertise in being able to support her. I was able to kind of suggest that she talk to the guidance counselor, point her to some community organizations that work to support housing and stability. But my academic credentials, my doctorate, right, really provided me with few tools to address what I thought were the root causes of the marginalization that she experienced, right? And this eventually got me to think, well, how did I get here, right? How did I get this really prestigious degree and feel still ill-equipped to address the inequities that I originally went to school to try to address, right? And so this is kind of where I am going to kind of try to think about more with you all today through this framework that I call Raciolinguistic Genealogy of the Self. And so how I understand this as a form of critical reflection, right? So that situates one's own life, in this sense I'm going to do me, right? Within the broader colonial relationships between race and language, right? And so part of what I'm going to be doing is implicating myself within broader colonial logics that kind of make me who I am, but also working to challenge these colonial logics by naming them, reflecting on them, trying to think differently. And so I'm going to reflect on kind of how my personal and familial experiences were shaped by these broader colonial relations of power, and also reflect on how my professional trajectory has been made possible by a reconfiguration of race that emerges in the post-civil rights era. That may not make sense yet. It's okay, because I hope that it'll make sense by the end. But so where do I begin? So I begin with Ricky Martin. I mean, Ricky Martin is kind of dated now for you, because you all are young. You probably were like, Ricky Martin, who's that? But so in the 90s, when Ricky Martin was still in the closet, right, why are we laughing about this? He came out with this song that was called Livin' La Vida Loca. Now, some of you may not know that song. If you don't, you should check it. It's good. But so those of us who are gay and Latino will sometimes call one another loca as a way of trying to play with each other. So it's a way of kind of reclaiming the pathological frames and to say, yeah, we're locas, and it's kind of, we're using the feminine, and it's a way to play with each other. So when Ricky Martin said he was living La Vida Loca, he was telling us things that he wasn't necessarily saying to everyone else yet, but we knew what he was saying, right? We knew what he was saying. And so the raciolinguistic genealogy of the self in some ways is that, right? People who've read my work before, some of you may have known what I was saying and how I was situated within it, but I never necessarily name it directly in a lot of my scholarship. And so the raciolinguistic genealogy of the self is really pushing me to think through how I may be more explicit in naming my relation to the work that I do. But in addition to that, Ricky Martin has kind of reflects a specific image of Latinidad that's one that's similar to the one that I think I inhabit. Someone who's white, right? Someone who is maybe framed as kind of a little exotic, but not too exotic, kind of this kind of ambiguous kind of ethnicity type thing that maybe can be used to sell products, right, in the ways that Ricky Martin has been able to sell products. But it's certainly just one image of what we could think of when we think of Latinidad, but it is one that I would say is dominant in society, right, and is one that I'm going to be unpacking and thinking through today. So I'm going to start by thinking through kind of Latinx identity, right, and kind of Latinidad. And so I'm not going to start with myself, though. I'm going to start with colonialism, right, because I have to situate that very category and how that category comes to make sense within histories of colonialism, right? And so the idea of Latin people, right, or Latinx people, or however term we're using nowadays, right, only becomes possible within the context of white settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade that produces what we now call the Americas, right? And we see kind of there, those of you who have ever taken like a history class probably have seen this triangle before, of the racial hierarchies that are produced within what would eventually become Latin America, right? Latin America is not there until it becomes invented as there, right? And so independence movements, right, from Spain, alongside the growing imperial power of the United States led the Creoles, who were the ones that were more at the top of this hierarchy, right, to begin to mobilize the image of, quote, Latin people with direct European lineage as an attempt to claim their full humanity, right? They say, well, we should be independent because our roots are in Europe, right? We're not indigenous. We're not Black. Our roots are Latin from Europe, right? And so it's a way of trying to kind of claim Europeanness as a way of claiming political rights that were being denied to Black and indigenous people, right? Now, that's one image of Latinidad, right? But that doesn't last that long, right? Because there's a racialization of Latinidad that happens as part of kind of broader geopolitics, right? One of the main points in this is the US colonization of parts of what was then Mexico, right? That led to a new racial order being mapped onto those existing racial hierarchies, right? So those racial hierarchies were there, and then US colonizers came in and said, you're all the same, right? And so there's racism mapped onto racism, right? And we see this through the reverse one-drop rule. That was kind of the discourse that was used to racialize Latinx people in the US. So we have the one-drop rule, which was used to racialize Black people in the US, right? And the idea there was if you have one drop of Black blood, you were Black. And why would they frame it that way? It was because if you were Black, then you were property, right? So it was to the advantage of white people to describe Blackness as broadly as possible in order to be able to have more property, right? On the flip side, the reverse one-drop rule said any presence of Spanish blood constituted white legal status regardless of phenotype. So it didn't matter what color you were. If you had any Spanish blood in you, you were legally white, right? But that didn't necessarily come with the same rights of whiteness as other white. It was kind of an off-white, like kind of white, but not really white, right? And so the racialization of the Spanish language became the way of denying legal rights to the new racialized category of Mexican, right? And this is where language becomes an important way that Latinidad is racialized in the United States, because segregation and discrimination is justified through the presence of this other language, right? And then we also, of course, have US colonization of Puerto Rico, which is kind of happening a little later, but part of this racialization of this category, which is the same kind of idea, right? There are existing racial hierarchies that exist in Puerto Rico that then US colonizers come in and say, well, you're all the same, right? And so there's racism mapped onto racism, right? And so Puerto Ricans were framed by US colonizers as partially European, but also culturally, linguistically, and racially inferior, primarily because of miscegenation, right? Because of the racial mixing that was happening in Puerto Rico. And so the goal of US colonizers was to Americanize Puerto Ricans through bilingual education, right? To get them access to English, even as they continue to be denied and are still continued to be denied equal political participation, right? And so I talked about a lot there, and I kind of wanted to kind of reiterate what I said. So if we're genealogically situating Latinidad, right, which is what I just did in those slides, we have to understand it both as a tool for reinforcing settler colonial and anti-Black logics, right, through the geopolitical construction of Latin America that sees all Latin people as the same in ways that erases and disavows Blackness and indigeneity. So it is that. But it's also a tool for racializing as part of US colonialism and imperialism, right? And so Latinidad is simultaneously a tool of oppression and an oppressed category, right? With settler colonial and anti-Black logics mapped onto existing settler colonial and anti-Black logics, right? And we don't have a lot of good discourse for making sense of the complexities of that. But it's super complex, right? That it's both a tool of oppression and an oppressed category and can serve as both within even the same space, right? And so its political mobilization is produced within this contradiction, right? And there are huge tensions in Latinx studies now precisely around kind of this and what we do with it, right? And so, okay, so now we get to my family, and you see, like, we're a little bit of everything, right? Like, which is like a very Puerto Rican family, like a little bit of everything, right? But and so that's kind of my family, and I'm going to situate the rise of my family within this reconfiguration of race that I mentioned before in the post-colonial world, right? And so you have all of these countries that are becoming independent now. At the same time that the atrocities of the Holocaust had happened, right? And so biological views of race fall out of favor, right? Because people saw the atrocities that can come from biologizing race, right? It leads to genocide, right? And so people were like, we probably don't want to subscribe to these biological views anymore. So what happens is that rather than talk about racial inequities in terms of biological differences, there's a shift towards talking about them in terms of cultural differences, which I think is still the way that people talk about racial inequities in a lot of contexts today. And so post-colonial nations were framed as primitive and in need of modernization, which is definitely a discourse in international development today. And racialized communities in the US were framed as having a culture of poverty that needed remediation. And so from this perspective, the root of racial inequities wasn't hundreds of years of racial oppression and the institutional policies that were entrenched because of that. It was because of deficiencies within the individuals. And so the solution wasn't to dismantle those structural forces. The solution was to fix those individuals because of their cultural deficiencies, right? And so this is the discourse that's emerging as the mainstream discourse within social science research in the 1960s. When my mother arrives to the US from Puerto Rico, which I guess is still the US, but you know what I mean. And so and I found this because I did some ancestry stuff. So she was officially classified as white on US Census forms, and she was a child in Puerto Rico in the 1950s. She was a baby. And she was classified as white. So was her father. I never met her father. She claims he was not what she would have considered white, right? So I think in some ways it was the census workers were just deciding what you look like and they were deciding for you, right? And so she arrived from Puerto Rico in 1962 when she was 12 years old. And of course, she didn't know this at the time, but this was part of a massive migration from the island as part of Operation Bootstrap, which was a US kind of policy that was trying to, quote, economically modernize the island by moving it away from a primarily kind of agricultural economy towards an industrial economy. And so people were being displaced from the lands that they were working, and they were moving to San Juan, and there weren't jobs in San Juan, and so they had to move primarily to New York, but other areas as well. So my grandmother came first. Her children stayed behind for many years, which was very common in the time. And eventually she was able to send for each of them individually. So my mother was able to see her mother again maybe after like 7 or 8 years when she was 12, right? And so when she started school, she was put back 2 grades. So she was supposed to be going into 6th grade, and she was put back into 4th grade because she didn't know English, right? And of course, we can imagine what the thinking was behind that, but it was coming from this culture of poverty idea that was like, there's something deficient about people who speak other languages and we need to fix it, right? And so bilingual education was just emerging as a policy option during the 1960s. And so she never had the opportunity for anything bilingual. She was too early in the wave, right? Bilingual education doesn't become something that begins happening in schools more towards the late 60s when she's already in high school and about to graduate. So my father actually was from Ecuador. And Ecuador has its own racial classification system that they kind of put on people's documents. And what he always reported to me was that he was officially classified as mestizo in the classification systems that they had in Ecuador at the time. And so in 1951, the year that he was born, bananas were the country's biggest export. based on high demand from the United States. People in the US love them some bananas, right? And they were buying those bananas. But the money wasn't going to people from Ecuador, right? The people who were making money off of the bananas were US corporations. United Fruit and Standard Fruit were the two making. Now, it's never a good idea to have one crop being your primary crop. Why is that not a good idea? Because if anything happens to that crop, your economy is devastated, right? And that's exactly what happened. In the 1960s, diseases affected the banana crops. With Cañar province, where my father was from, hit particularly hard. And so he was not the oldest, but he was the oldest son. He was 17 at the time, but there was no money, and so he had to come to the United States, right? And so actually, when I started doing research about this, I learned, I don't think any of us knew, this was actually the beginning of a wave specifically from that province to New York City. He was like on the cutting edge of that wave that would grow over the years. And he had to falsify documents because he wasn't 18, right? And you can't get a visa unless you're 18 to travel alone. And so he has different birthdays on different like paperworks and things like that. But a lot of us probably have people in our lives that have different birthdays and things like that on their paperwork. But unlike my mom, he did not come to go to school, right? He came to work. He was 17 when he came, and he came to work. So he never actually attended U.S. schools. But they met at my mom's cousin's party at some point, and they got married in 1972. I know, look at that. I was like, oh, when I asked my mom for a presentation, I said, Mom, I need a picture of you getting married for a presentation. She didn't even ask. She knows that I just do weird stuff. She was like, sure, take the picture. And so that was them, right? And so like I want to now kind of take stock of what I just kind of was talking about here, right? So both my mother and my father were geopolitically positioned as coming from the third world, which is not a term people use as much anymore. It was more kind of Cold War politics at the time. Now when people talk about global South within the context of neoliberal capitalism, right? As an extension of earlier imperial relationships, right? And so they were both framed as coming from backwards countries, although Puerto Rico was a commonwealth, right? But it was still framed as backwards, right? And in need of modernization in the image of the US. And these interventions of the US trying to lead to this modernization would contribute to both of their displacements to New York City, right? Now, their shared use of Spanish brought them to the same community and to the same event, right? It's unlikely they would have ever seen themselves as having anything in common in Puerto Rico or in Ecuador, right? But now they're living in the same city, they share the same language, they're going to the same events, they're meeting the same people, right? Now, because neither of them was classified as Black or Indigenous, right, Spanish use was really the primary factor in their continued racialization when they came to the US, where they were part of communities that were described through the discourses of the culture of poverty, right? And so like then this is like where like I kind of come into this. This was me in middle school. That was my little diorama of the lung that I made with the little tissue papers that we had. I don't know if people do that anymore, but we had like tissue paper that we had to make our little organs with. And I was born in Philadelphia, but I'll get to that. But okay, so let me talk about my raciolinguistic socialization into English, right? So I inherited the racial positioning of my parents, right? I'm neither Black nor Indigenous. So the primary kind of experiences of racialization and marginalization that I've experienced has been through language, right? And in particular, there's been a familial shift over time from Spanish to English, right? And so my parents, when they spoke with one another before my brother was born, primarily used Spanish with one another. And to the day my father passed, they primarily would use Spanish with one another. And my brother was born in New York City, and they primarily used Spanish. And then they moved to Philadelphia, which is a whole other thing. The migration from New York City to Philadelphia was a thing at the time too. But quickly, he transitioned to English because it wasn't as bilingual of a context as the neighborhood that they grew in New York. There were really no other bilingual people around him. And so what's interesting is that though English became the primary language of the home, by the time I was born, I mean, I would speak to my parents pretty much all the time in English, although they would use both with me, and I understood both. I began to get the sense pretty early that the English that I used was not really what people thought of as English, right? So, for example, some of the terms that I would use that I thought were English terms, people would tell me were not English terms. And so, for example, when I was in first grade, my first grade teacher, she was a lovely teacher, Miss W. But she asked us, like, I don't know why she was asking us about, like, what our favorite TV show was. And I said La Novela, which is like Spanish for soap opera, but I didn't know the word soap opera at the time. It still sounds weird to me to call it soap opera. And it was just a term that we used to call the show. It was La Novela. So I had no sense that this was a term that other people didn't recognize as English because I thought I was an English speaker, right? And so I quickly began to see that some of the ways that we talked at home weren't quite the ways that we were supposed to talk at school. Right? And I quickly began to try to use words that other people knew were English words and separate those from words that I used at home that just passed as like whatever. They were just English, they were Spanish, we didn't know what they were, right? And so even though English I considered my primary language, there was something about my English that seemed a little off to people, and I had to learn how to navigate that. But I would say that I had like a more tumultuous relationship with Spanish. Where my relationship is where I would say I experienced most of my racialization was around Spanish, right? In particular, people were very confused as to like how I could be, well, in Philly, people say Spanish, right? How you can be Spanish and not know Spanish, right? Because they don't say Latino, Latinx, they say Spanish, right? I don't know if that's a thing in DC, but it's a thing in Philly. But, and people were confused as to like how I couldn't know Spanish as someone who was Spanish, right? And my high school Spanish class, people would ask me that question. And it was hard to answer because I did understand everything that the teacher was saying. But I couldn't necessarily respond to the teacher in the ways that I would have liked, right? So people thought I was faking it, right? They were like, well, you understand everything he's saying, so clearly you know Spanish. And I was like, well, no, I understand it, but I can't necessarily speak it. Didn't make sense to anyone, right? Maybe it makes sense to some of you in this audience. Maybe it's some of your experiences. Yes, you get it. But it was very confusing to other people. And there was one time that a substitute teacher came to the class, and she told me that I should expand my horizons by learning an actual foreign language. And I was like, so wait, Spanish can be a foreign language to me? So is English my foreign language? Like, what the heck is a foreign language to me, right? And there's a lot of like things that I'm trying to figure out as a 15-year-old, right? And then there's also then my raciolinguistic ideologies related to bilingualism, right? So I kind of came to the conclusion at some point where maybe I just had problems with both English and Spanish, right? I seemed to mess up English and think that some Spanish words were English words, right? And then in Spanish class, I wasn't supposed to be there because it wasn't my foreign language, but then I would use words and the teacher would say, well, that's not Spanish, that's Spanglish, right? And so I didn't even know proper Spanish, right? And so I attributed this to my own personal inadequacies, right? I felt like there was something wrong with my language, that I wasn't bilingual, I was semi-lingual, right? I didn't really know any language well. And so just to kind of take stock on this, so long-standing colonial discourses, right, framed Latinx people as culturally and linguistically deficient, right? And the culture of poverty discourses argued that intergenerational poverty had produced semilingual as opposed to bilingual children who needed bilingual education as a temporary bridge to the development of English, right? And that discourse, though, doesn't directly affect me because I was never classified as an English learner, right? So I was never even eligible for any of these programs, impacts the patterns that emerge in my house, right? So the transitional mindset of the society led to a shift from Spanish to English in my home. At the same time, the bilingualism of my home didn't map onto the monolingualism of the school, and my English and Spanish were both seen as just not appropriate for school. So my conclusion was that I was bilingual, that I was not bilingual, but I was semilingual, right? So language became the primary mechanism of the marginalization that I was experiencing, right? which is a very particular image of Latinidad, right? It doesn't capture the racism experienced by Black and Indigenous Latinx people, right? Because it's framing it just in terms of language, because that's the primary way that many Latinx people who end up in positions like this, who get to talk about it, experience things, right? So I want us to kind of sit with that and reflect on that. And so how do I end up in bilingual education from there? I went from like being like, I don't know any language. Now like I'm a researcher in bilingual education. How the heck did that happen, right? And so to think about this genealogically, right? In the US civil rights era, where bilingual education reemerges as a policy option, right? I mean, it existed in earlier times in US history, but modern bilingual education reemerges in the 1960s, right? There are two orientations to understanding racial inequities that are part of this conversation that frame bilingual education. One is the culture of poverty, which we've talked about before, right? That argued that multiple generations of poverty led to cultural pathologies that prevented racialized communities from escaping poverty. And this was primarily used by social scientists and policymakers to develop programs to fix these cultural pathologies, right? This is where you get compensatory education and all kinds of remediation that really, in many ways, still exists today. But on the other side, you have people who are arguing for cultural maintenance, right? The argument here was that multiple generations of racial oppression led racialized communities to be disconnected from their cultural identities. And this was used primarily by civil rights advocates to promote more culturally affirming educational spaces. So at the time, these were framed as kind of opposing to one another. In genealogical work, we begin to look at actually maybe they're not as different as people assume them to be, right? And so what do I mean by that? So I'm providing a very broad overview of ideologies here, so please forgive the reductiveness of it. But in general, when we look at the discourses of the 1960s and how race, language were talked about in relation to culture of poverty and maintenance, African Americans were framed as having no additional language that could be incorporated into remediation or maintained. They had no home language practices that were worth bringing into remediation at all. We would just remediate them strictly through standard American English, right? Native Americans were framed as having no additional language with a legitimate literary tradition that could be incorporated into remediation or maintained unless it was modernized in some ways. One prominent exception to this rule was Navajo, where there were lots of bilingual education programs that were emerging in this time, because in some ways it fit into what the primarily kind of Western-trained linguists of the time thought of as a modern language, right? And so Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, in contrast, were framed as having an additional legitimate language with a legitimate literary tradition. I mean, Spanish is a European language, right? And it has existed for a long time and has wealth of literary tradition. So the idea was that this could be incorporated into their remediation or maintained, right? But first, there needed to be remediation before it could be maintained, because their Spanish wasn't good enough and their English wasn't good enough. It needed to be fixed first in order for it to be maintained. So even though there is an acknowledgement of an additional, of a legitimate language and literary tradition here, the population themselves are still framed as less than, right? But it's important to say that bilingual education is really only framed as a legitimate tool for that population, certainly not for African Americans. It wasn't even seen as a possibility to think of bilingual education to serve African Americans in that time period, right? And so I kind of, I forgot how much I'm trying to go through here, so a range of bilingual education programs emerged in the 60s that are coming out of the culture of poverty theory, right? And so one prominent example was the Good Samaritan, which was talked about like if you, I promise you, if you look into any 1960s conversation about bilingual education, the Good Samaritan came up. It was everywhere. Everyone loved the Good Samaritan. And just to kind of give you a sense of the rationale for the Good Samaritan, these are some quotes from its like actual like documentation about its justification for itself, right? And you can see like just the first one here, that the argument was that Spanish dominant children lacked the capacity for abstract language, which is a very like strong statement to make about an entire population, right? But that was the justification for the bilingual education program. They lacked the capacity to think abstractly, And bilingual education would build a strong foundation for them that would allow them to think abstractly. Now, some of us would be like, but people talk about students having strong foundations in their L1 all the time still. So it's the same, it's just talked about a little nicer now, right? So again, we should take pause and think about that. But my argument is that semilingualism also continues to inform cultural maintenance conversations, right? And so the primary way that cultural maintenance gets taken up, right, is this idea that coercive relations of power had led to what people in that perspective call subtractive bilingualism, right? That has gradually replaced Spanish with English, right? And that additive bilingualism could challenge these coercive relations of power by ensuring these students develop academic language in Spanish that they can transfer to English. So you're going to develop the strong foundation in the L1 that will transfer to the L2, right? And I mean, it's not me just making this up, right? So people like literally have made connections from semilingualism to discussions of academic language, right? Where the argument here, there appears to be relatively little dispute about the existence of the phenomenon. I dispute the existence of the phenomenon. But rather than saying they're semilingual, it's limited access to academic registers in both L1 and L2. So the problem is still located within the individuals and the communities rather than within the structures and institutions, right? And so this debate is happening, right, where the Bilingual Education Act is passed, right, in 1968. Now, the culture of poverty people really, for the most part, win in shaping the BEA, right? So the BEA is not really talking about maintenance really much at all. There are people who are using BEA funds to try to focus on maintenance, but the policy itself is really focused on transition, right? But as part of this act, Title VII fellowship programs were developed. And Title VII fellowship programs supported Latinx educators in pursuing doctorates to develop bilingual teacher education programs. Because at the time, there was no understanding of what bilingual education was, right? And so if you want to prepare bilingual teachers, you need teacher education programs to prepare them. And if you need teacher education programs, you need teacher educators to teach in those programs, right? And so Title VII fellowships were a way of funding people to get the training that they needed in order to be able to create and run these programs. So this frames bilingual education as a legitimate area of research with associated funding and increasing numbers of Latinx scholars seeking to do research to improve Latinx education. So this is an interesting thing. Many people who are applying for Title VII fellowships are interested in improving Latinx education, right? And for all students, they don't care if they're bilingual or monolingual, they're supporting Latinx students. But the funding is available to them to frame things in terms of language and bilingual education. So of course, yeah, I want money to like get my degree. And so I'll frame it in terms of language for you if that's what I need to do, even if that's not necessarily what I think the issue is, right? And so it's a tactical thing, right? But it then leads to bilingual education becoming one of the only research areas in education that talks about Latinx students, right? But that wasn't by accident. And so when I do genealogy, I'm like, because I was like, that's why I ended up in bilingual education, right? Because I decided to pursue a degree in education precisely for that reason. I wanted to give back and support Latinx students, right? But when I began to try to do research on that, most of that research was in bilingual education. It didn't necessarily map onto my life or the life of most of the students that I was thinking of. None of us had been in bilingual education. Most of us hadn't been classified as English learners. But it provided me a space where, oh, people talking about us. And so, of course, I gravitated towards that, right? At the time, I didn't know that it was because of all these funding mechanisms, right? But I then learned about this academic language thing, right? And I was like, oh. So I began to ask, had my Latinx friends and relatives who had not experienced the academic success I experienced been because they had only mastered social language and not academic language? I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed that I even asked that question, but at the time, I mean, I was an undergrad. I mean, no offense to the undergrads, you all are great. But I just mean, I'm reading something, I don't know, I'm figuring it out, and then this is what you're telling me. So, okay, sure, I'll go with it, right? But it doesn't last long, right? But so I became an ESL teacher after graduating, right? And I had many students who were classified as long-term English learners. So these were students born and raised in the US, right, like me, but they were classified as English learners in high school. So that's kind of weird. And I was like, that is kind of weird. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting to be working with students who were like recent arrivals as an ESL teacher, right? And so how do I make sense of this? Well, what I learned was that they lacked academic language in both English and Spanish, and that my job was to fix this. So I really accepted this semilingualism as the starting point and saw my job being to fix them, right? That was me. Look at me. I know that was my first year of teaching. I know I've aged, but eventually this begins to rub me the wrong way, right? Because there's a contradiction, right? How is it possible for students who I observed using English and Spanish every day, right, to be simultaneously classified as English learners and deficient in Spanish, right? And how did this connect to my own experiences that I shared with you before, right? So it's like, wait a minute, I was the one that was made to feel like my English and Spanish were not good enough, and now here I am, this teacher, positioning my students in the same way, right? It didn't sit with me right? And so to take back on this, right, before I kind of have my final part of this presentation. So semilingualism provided the ideological foundation justified bilingual education for Latinx students, right? Title VII fellowships offered funding for Latinx educators to enter bilingual education, and they had to balance this kind of verbal deprivation, semilingualism, with their desire for something else, right? For more culturally affirming education for all Latinx students and really for all students, right? And so this gets taken up by talking about social versus academic language, subtractive versus additive bilingualism, but the point of intervention is still the students, right? And it's still to fix the students. And so this is not me trying to blame anyone, right? This is me trying to point to the problems of the system, right? And the complexities of navigating a system that really is not well designed to do the type of work that people like us want to do, right? And so the legacy of the Title VII fellowships had created a robust area of bilingual education research that was available to me when I decided to pursue a degree in education, and I was like, hey, I want to learn about how to better support Latinx students. Hey, it's all in bilingual education, right? And so I, too, was recruited to balance semilingualism with the desire for more culturally affirming education. Though at the time, I had no idea that social versus academic language had direct roots in semilingualism. I didn't learn that history until later. So that part wasn't my fault. The people who taught me, that was their fault for not telling me that. And so I used this framework in ways that enacted deficit ideologies on my community and students, right? And I try not to beat myself up about that. I mean, I did the best that I could, but yeah, I think I inflicted real harm on my students because I was trying to fix them instead of working with them to do something different than that, right? But my own raciolinguistic socialization eventually led me to question those deficit frames, which is an important lesson for all of us, right? It rubbed me the wrong way because my experience was reminding me that it wasn't right, right? And so whenever we see these things that seem like they don't make sense, it's probably because they don't make sense, and we should question them, right? And so this is me then resisting, because now you're like, what, you should do all these things? Anyone who's read me now, they're like, oh, I'm burn it all down, right? But that wasn't me then, right? But I began then to resist, right? And I went back to doctoral studies precisely to try to understand that contradiction that I had mentioned before of this doesn't make any sense. Help it make sense to me. And I had the great opportunity to work with Dr. Ofelia Garcia, who is a Cuban-American scholar, who had also been professionally funneled into bilingual education as a professor of City College, and that eventually brought her to the CUNY Graduate Center. And she's kind of talked with me openly about, for her, the concern was never bilingual education for bilingual education's sake. Her concern was always supporting Latinx students, and she saw bilingual education as a point of entry for doing that. But her understanding was always more broad than that, right? And so she helped me to begin to see this history that I hadn't experienced because I was younger than her, right? And the complexities of the decision-making that went into those experiences, right? But as part of her research, she developed this idea of translanguaging as a counter-narrative to these deficit ideas of semilingualism, right? And she first introduced it into this book. I was in my first graduate class with her. We read page proofs of this book before it even came out. So we didn't even know it was going to like become a thing. I mean, but it became a thing. But and in this book and in her subsequent work, she's really thinking about kind of what ideas about language we can develop if we center the strategic crossing of socially constructed linguistic borders of Latinx communities as the starting point for developing those theories of language and education, right? So rather than trying to find problems within them, seeing what they do as the solution, right? And to use that as the center of what we do with our students. For her, it's always been a political stance, right? Working to denaturalize dominant deficit perspectives of Latinx and other minoritized communities. And so I've always understood translanguaging within that same political framework that Ophelia has talked about it in. I think others maybe don't have that same political framing, but that's been my socialization into it. And so I had translanguaging now as a counter-narrative, and I was like, ooh, okay, this is giving me some things to work with. And then I reconnected. Well, I mean, we didn't reconnect. I mean, we were still friends, but like someone that I met as an undergraduate, Jonathan Rosa, after we graduated, he went into linguistic anthropology, like straight from undergrad to doctoral work, which I could not have done. And I went into classroom teaching. And we were still friends, but like our professional paths seemed to have diverged, right? And then like one day he was talking about his work in linguistic anthropology, right? And kind of how, and he said something, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And he was like, stop making fun of me. Because he thought I was like, oh, I don't care about that. I'm a classroom teacher. But no, I was actually interested in what he had to say and thinking about these things. And what we eventually kind of began to talk about together are kind of the ways that both of us kind of were moved into studies of language, because we were trying to really understand the racialization of Latinidad, right? And racialization in general, right? And that eventually moves us into kind of this raciolinguistic perspective that I think both of us in collaboration are known for, right? And a raciolinguistic perspective like shifts the analytic away from the speaker to the listener. So if the listener hears someone as semilingual, that's the listener's problem, right? That's not the speaker's problem. And it also connects those listening positions to broader histories of colonialism. So it's not about that individual listener as an individual, right? It's that they've been socialized into long-standing colonial logics that frame certain populations as linguistically inadequate, right? And so I'm not trying to blame anyone. I'm not trying to call anyone individually racist, although there are individually people who are racist, right? But that's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm trying to challenge us all to critically interrogate the listening practices and the perceptions that we've been socialized into, and really unravel the ideologies that are maybe part of that, right? And so raciolinguistic genealogy, which is what I'm doing now, right? So I'm moving beyond the perspective to the genealogy, has provided me with methodological tools for studying the traces of these colonial logics in the present, which is what I'm doing here, right? And so just to kind of genealogically situate my resistance, the marginalization I experienced as a US Latinx person, right, pushed me into eventually resisting this professional funneling into bilingual education. Where it's like, it's not just about language, right? There are all of these other things that we have to think about, right? And rather than try to fit myself into the box of language, I said, no, we need to think about language in connection to these other things, right? And something that I've begun to do more recently in my work, right, is to situate this within anti-Black and settler colonial logics, right, which are happening in simultaneity with the racialization of Latinidad in complex ways, right? And what's interesting to me is that as I've presented this work to many senior Latinx scholars, like Ophelia and others, right, they've opened up to me about like similar tensions that they've experienced throughout their career. Of like saying it's not just about language. There are all of these other things to consider, and really trying to think about how to talk about those other things, right, in ways that are going to be have an impact on the field, right? And they've always been very supportive of me continuing to do that, right? I haven't experienced them as gatekeepers. I have experienced them as saying, yes, do it, right? Keep pushing. And so I think bilingual education, in my experience as a research field, right, has been a way of opening previously closed doors, right? It literally allowed Latinx people into the academy that were systematically barred before, right? But also allowed them to keep the door open for the next generation who are continuing to push even further than maybe they were able to within the constraints that they were working in their generation, right? And so just to kind of name like the queer subtext to all of this, because in case you didn't know, I'm gay. Jonathan and I are both queer, right? And this picture that I gave before was at I think this was San Francisco Pride or something. And so and that's me with my husband, right? And that's me being a butterfly. And so I'm very resistant to kind of named languages and boundaries around these things. Also is informed by my resistance to boundaries around gender and sexuality and all of those ways of controlling and managing people, right? And so part of my work now is also beginning to think about that piece of it and naming that more explicitly too as myself, right? And that's still very much a work in progress that I'm just beginning. And so where do I go from here, right? So I think I continue to resist recruitment into long-standing colonial logics that frame Latinx students as linguistically deficient. I'm just not going to even accept that as the beginning of a conversation anymore, right? And I think I need to continue to further link these deficit frames with anti-Black and settler colonial projects, right? So, for example, grappling with the erasure of Blackness and indigeneity and dominant constructions of Latinidad as a political identity, right? And what happens when we frame things just in terms of language or just in terms of Latinidad in ways that don't name the specific challenges and barriers confronted by Black and Indigenous people who also have connections to Latin America. And the recognition that dismantling the racialization of Latinidad in the US entails dismantling all of these other logics of racialization as well, right? These are not separate projects from one another. They actually have to happen in conjunction with one another, because if any group is being racialized, then there's still the possibility of racializing everybody, right? And I'm working to make more explicit connection to the colonial roots of other forms of social differentiation and their co-naturalization with race in particular. I'm starting to think more about gender and sexual binaries, and I'm really been starting to do some reading on transgender studies to think about how that may relate to translanguaging, right, and how I can think about those connecting to each other. And continuing to genealogically situate myself within my work. I don't usually like writing about myself, but I'm trying to push myself more to do that. And to really embrace the political identity of an outsider, right? The spaces of academia weren't designed for people like me. Rather than trying to make myself fit that, I'll make it fit me, right? And embrace the fact that I'm the outsider, right? And that actually gives me a different perspective that may be important to contribute to these spaces. And also continuing to critically reflect on the erasures that have been produced by the political identities that I've inhabited, right? Like Latinidad, right? Like queerness, like these other identities. What are the erasures that are there so that we can continue to critically think about the challenges of engaging in political work that's not premised on the oppression of anybody, right? So thank you so much for your attention.